Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're logging in from. Welcome to the Land Dialogue webinar series, organized in partnership with the Ford Foundation, the Land Portal Foundation, the Tenure Facility, and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Thank you for joining us. My name is Finn, and I'm a journalist specializing in food systems and climate change, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's session, which is reflecting on the outcomes of COP27 climate negotiations that concluded 2 weeks ago. Now, I remember moderating a Land Dialogue webinar last year, right after COP26, and there was a lot of excitement over this $1.7 billion funding pledge to support Indigenous and local communities who have historically been greatly underfunded. There was also acknowledgement of their role as guardians of the world's forests. COP27, and they'll tell us about what happened, what needs to be done to ensure that there's renewed and continued focus on supporting community land rights and governance of territories, and that not only is there funding, but that the money is fit for purpose. We will also be presenting and discussing the recently launched Indigenous Peoples and Local Community Forest Tenure Pledge Annual Report 2021 and 2022 as well. Now, before I introduce you to our speakers, let me just go through some housekeeping rules. This webinar is in English, but we have simultaneous translations in Spanish, French, and Portuguese. To access the translations, all you need to do is go to the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. Then click on it and then select the language that you want. Now, this webinar is going to be for 90 minutes. We're going to first have a discussion for about an hour, followed by a Q&A for about 30 minutes. So if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A box and not the chat box. But do use the chat box to let us know who you are, which organization you belong to, and where you're joining us from. Feel free to tweet also using this hashtag LandDialogues in one word. And you can also follow live tweeting from the Land Portal and Tenure Facility Twitter accounts. And finally, we are also recording today's session, and we will share the link with you afterwards. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, let me introduce you to our star-studded lineup of speakers. And in the interest of fairness, I'm going to introduce our speakers in alphabetical order based on their first names. So first, we have Casey Box, Director of Global Strategy at the Christensen Fund. Now, Casey has over a decade of experience with expertise in advocating for Indigenous rights, participatory grant making, network building, and environmental issues. Casey previously served as the Executive Director of Land is Life. We also have Christina Koch, a Ukakchi Mayan community leader from Southern Belize. Now, Christina is the founder and program director of the Julian Cho Society, which is dedicated to conserving the environments and rights of Indigenous peoples of Southern Belize. She's also the co-spokesperson for the Maya Leadership Alliance. Next, we have Jenny Lopez, Land Governance Advisor, who's responsible for land tenure rights programming and policy work at the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, or FCDO. Now, Jenny has been supporting the UK's role as chair of the donor working group to deliver progress on the COP26 IPLC Forest Tenure Pledge commitments. We also have Juan Carlos Gintiac from the Shuar people of the Ecuadorian Amazon. Juan Carlos is the Executive Secretary of the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities and Senior Advisor on International Affairs to the Coordinator of Indigenous Organizations of the Amazon Basin, or COICA for short. Juan Carlos was previously served as a focal point and co-chair at the Indigenous Caucus at the UNFCCC. Juan Carlos will be speaking in Spanish. And last, but definitely not the least, we have Toya Manchineri from the Manchineri people in Acre. Now, Toya is the coordinator for the Articulation of Indigenous People of Brazil, ABIP. Toya is also a member of the Coordination of Indigenous Organizations of the Brazilian Amazon and Area Coordinator for Territory and Natural Resources at COICA. Toya will be speaking in Portuguese. So how this is going to work is that I'm going to be asking a few rounds of questions to our speakers, and I would really like this to be a discussion. So I would encourage the panelists to, if you can, respond to each other's answers and build on them. And if you actually want to come in after somebody has answered as well, you can just raise your hand like this, and I will bring you in. Now to the audience, again, please use the Q&A box to send your questions. And also, please, if you can, identify yourself and your organization, and we'll get to them during the Q&A portion of the event. Now, I'm going to start by asking all of our speakers to share their reflections of COP27. And if possible, I'd like them to take no more than 2 to 3 minutes each to answer this question. Juan Carlos, I know you were wanting the other Indigenous leaders to speak first, but you have a lot of experience in the international arena, and you had a previous role as well with the UNFCCC. So if you don't mind, I'm going to come to you first. Now, compared to COP26, how did COP27 go? Did you think the promises and the pledges from last year, were there any progress to them, or are you disappointed with the outcome? What are your reflections?
Hola a todos. Muchas gracias por la invitación a este webinar y la oportunidad de compartir, saludar a mis hermanos, líderes, a lideresas, Cristina, Toya, a mis colegas, a compañeros. Creo que es importante entender el largo caminar que ha tenido el movimiento indígena desde el territorio al sistema internacional. Es importante reconocer que las organizaciones, las comunidades están trabajando permanentemente y llevan las demandas al sistema internacional. Muchos líderes y lideresas han trabajado en esa línea. El tema de cambio climático es una arena más, la COP26, la COP27 y las que vienen, para elevar las demandas, para coordinar y proponer nuestros derechos. Ahora, reconociendo todo eso, evaluamos, nos conectamos la arena internacional, los pueblos indígenas, comunidades locales, entre todos, y nos preparamos para conectar y evaluar, presentar coordinadamente entre nosotros, entre las 7 regiones socioculturales, que se llama el Foro Indígena de Cambio Climático sobre la temática del clima. Ahora, dicho esto, es importante mencionar que los pueblos indígenas elevamos una voz grande para reclamar el tema de las finanzas, los financiamientos. Hay más reclamos, pero ha sido un momento crítico, doble, para entender dónde están yendo estos compromisos, cómo se están activando estos compromisos, estas promesas. El 1.7 que salió billones en rescatamos, aplaudimos en la COP26, ha tenido un proceso de diálogo, de comunicación para implementar. La COP27 nos ha conectado para mirar esta oportunidad si se puede implementar o no. Mis hermanas, mis hermanos, jóvenes y mujeres llegan a estos momentos para reclamar, para proponer la propuesta, pero reclamando de que no está todo bien en el territorio, no están llegando esos financiamientos. Por último, sin embargo, es importantísimo mencionar que se abrió la dinámica sobre el tema financiero. Está el tema financiero en la mesa de debate. ¿Cómo vamos a aterrizar esto? Creemos que es importante que la dinámica va entre la comunicación, entre la transparencia y el respeto que tenemos que tener las organizaciones, las comunidades, los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales en sí. Se debe entrar en un marco de acción. Acción y, punto 1, aplicación y acción. 2, aplicación y acción. 3, aplicación. Y eso es, en resumen, la memoria viviente que se está viviendo en este momento. Estamos a la expectativa para aterrizar estas promesas y ya en concreto. Hay muchas dinámicas, hay muchas ideas, hay muchos planteamientos, pero creemos que el movimiento indígena está sólido en el marco de sus derechos, derechos al tema de la información y transparencia y aterrizar estos recursos a los territorios. Muchas gracias, Tim.
Muchas gracias, Juan Carlos. And, you know, we're going to focus the next round of questions specifically on financing. So definitely want to, you know, come on how to make sure that, you know, not just that there's money, but that money, it's going directly and it's also fit for purpose. But Christina, can I come to you next? As an Indigenous leader, what are your reflections and thoughts from COP27?
Thank you kindly. First of all, thank you for the honor and the privilege to be a part of this very important webinar. I bring my greetings from my people. My impressions of COP27, I imagine that in COP26, which I didn't attend personally, but I follow, there were many promises made, including the pledge for funding towards climate action and towards, in particular, Indigenous peoples, lands, and territories. In COP27, my impression was that there was a lot of backtracking. There was a lot of attempt to remove even the basic language of Indigenous peoples' rights and human rights in particular. Given that, you know, in COP26, there was this insistence on recognizing that Indigenous people are the guardians of the world's forests. But when it came to the implementation COP, or what was being referred to as the implementation COP, we quickly saw a diminishing of that perspective and that focus and that emphasis. And so, you know, my impression was that while this was one occasion where we were able to mobilize the largest showing of Indigenous peoples at such an important forum, unfortunately, we were still invisible and we were still not being heard. It was very difficult to even try to put our demands and our interests at the fore. We were looking for ally countries as a global Indigenous caucus to really bring forth the concerns and the issues that Indigenous peoples globally are raising. In particular, the focus of COP27 was on loss and damage. And in that particular area, or in that particular agenda, we want to ensure that whatever climate action is being proposed or accepted, that it does no harm to Indigenous communities, that it upholds the rights and the interests of Indigenous and forest-dependent communities, and in particular that it be done within the human rights framework. And so we found it very difficult to really find a way to get our agenda, our interests, our concerns heard in a meaningful way. And I think this is too important of a forum to have the voices of Indigenous people invisible. And so our demand is that world leaders recognize that climate change cannot be confronted without the meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples globally.
Thanks, Christina. Very sobering reflections. I now want to go to the two donors, actually, whether they, had the same experience and drew the same conclusions, or they saw something slightly different. Casey, can I come to you first?
Sure, thank you. COP27 set a historic record for participation of Indigenous leaders, as was previously mentioned. I think it would be easy to say that even the word Indigenous itself was mentioned more than all the other COPs combined. As many of you know, governments and philanthropies signed a historic $1.7 billion pledge to support Indigenous peoples and local community efforts towards forest tenure rights in tropical and subtropical forests, of which my foundation, the Christensen Foundation, was one signatories of the pledge. At COP27, the signatories, also known as the Forest Tenure Funder Group, released their report, which you can find on Land Portal's website, on where they stand on commitments. Perhaps someone can provide the link. And while we are collectively on track to meet our commitments, only 7% of the $1.7 billion pledge made in Glasgow has been sent directly to Indigenous peoples and local community organizations. While this number was unfortunately expected, it is embarrassing. So as the world seeks to address climate crisis, it cannot be done exclusively in the hallways of closed rooms and climate conferences. We must recognize that the rights and ways of life of Indigenous peoples and local communities they have been stewards of ecosystems for the world that is now racing to protect. Without them, we are hopeless. All too often, we speak of lack of capacity of local organizations to do more effective and receive more funding. Indigenous peoples and local communities have capacity. They just need direct funding. It is time that we view capacity as a two-way street. Donors have a lot to do on their end to see how we can work better and more directly with Indigenous peoples and local communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Casey. 7%. That is quite a shocking figure. Jenny, can I come to you next?
Yes, thanks everyone. Thanks for this opportunity to be here, and I'm very privileged to be with our other speakers today. So yeah, I think Casey summed a lot of it up very well. I'll just build on that, and that's on behalf of the pledge specifically. So I think for us, it was never going to be at COP27 the big, grand announcement as we achieved at COP26 on the 1.7 billion. The purpose of this year really for us at COP27 was about how we can really report and be held accountable, what our latest how we're going to report on what we've managed to achieve this first year, and that was, as Casey said, that was part for us of the launch of that first public report from the donors, and that's part of our accountability. And we've said very early on, we now have this commitment as donors to be held accountable and increase transparency. So the report was the first sign of that, and we're committed to keep that ongoing. As Casey said, it showed that 1/5, so that's 90% of that 1.7 has now been dispersed, but that figure of 7% reaching IP and LC-led organisations is, of course, very much needs to be increased. And donors very clearly acknowledge that's not good enough. However, I mean, it is an increase on that 1%. Which in the Falling Short report was that Rainforest Foundation Norway produced in 2021. It does show that there is starting to be an increase, but as we're all saying, it's not good enough. We need to demonstrate a greater shift, and as the report demonstrates, as I think all donors will very clearly agree, it's not enough, and we need to be held accountable for that. I really like Juan Carlos's framing that the pledge right from the beginning was a dialogue. It will continue to be a dialogue, and I mean, I think now it's at the stage where we need to work together. It's not about the announcement, it's not just about the amount, it's about how we're going to deliver that, but also how we're going to do it at scale. Just two more points before I finish is one thing I think was really exciting and important was at COP27 at the World Leaders Summit, we had IPLC leaders from GATC speak for the first time alongside government leaders. I think that was a really significant and historic moment, and we achieved that again at the World Leaders Summit this year, again with two leaders from GATC speaking, and this time it was on stage the President of Norway, presidents and prime ministers from all over the world, and I think that's also something we need to continue, those opportunities to have visibility in high-level platforms, which IPLC leaders are a part of. And finally, I think one thing that was encouraging was we had 3 new donors that were announced this year to the pledge. That's Wellspring Philanthropic Fund, 2 members of Protecting Our Partnership Planet Challenge, so that's Bobolink Foundation and the International Conservation Fund of Canada. So that again is just a demonstration of how more donors are recognising this agenda and want to be a part of this dialogue.
Thank you, Jenny. So yes, essentially 7% is abysmal, but it is an improvement, and it seems like there are more funders coming in, and there's at least people are aware that this needs to change, which is good news. Could I just actually remind all the speakers again to speak a little bit slower than you normally would? I'm hearing requests from the interpreters that they're sort of having trouble following if you speak very, very fast. So again, if you could speak a little bit slower, we would really appreciate it. Toya, can I come to you last to round up the reflections? You heard from all of the other speakers. Again, you were there in person, you saw all the debates. What are your reflections, you know, as an Indigenous leader on what happened at COP27? Toya,
Hola.
are you there?
Creo que sí. Ok. Oye.
Ok, primeiro de tudo, né, quero agradecer, né, pelo convite, né, desse momento, dessa live, né, e dizer que, né, as COPs, né, não só a 26, a 27, mas anteriores, né, ela trouxe muitos avanços, né, no debate sobre a questão climática, né, mas sobre o Acordo de Paris, né, e entre a questão do RED, né. E mais recente, na 26, né, a promessa, né, dos recursos destinados, né, às populações indígenas. A questão é, né, como que nós todos, os doadores, os parceiros, né, podem, né, colocar esse recurso, né, no território, né? Então, a grande questão é, temos 1,7 bilhões, ou se tivéssemos 10 bilhões, né, como que 50% ou 70% desse recurso beneficiaria, né, as populações indígenas, né? Nesse sentido, né, nós temos trabalhado, né, o fortalecimento, né, de um fundo, né, que se chama PODALE, né, que é o Fundo Indígena da Amazônia Brasileira. Através deste fundo, nós conseguimos chegar diretamente, né, às populações indígenas, né, ao território, né, que é importante, né, que esses recursos cheguem realmente nas comunidades, nas aldeias, né, porque lá que está sofrendo todos os impactos, né, seja ele, né, das mudanças climáticas, seja ele do desmatamento, né, das invasões de garimpo ilegal, né? Então, é necessário que a gente, né, discuta o montante, mas também os caminhos, né, que possamos, né, estar fazendo um melhor para que esses recursos cheguem, né? A COP27, né, a gente foi para lá, enquanto COIAB, enquanto a PIB, Movimento Indígena do Brasil, né, com o objetivo de trilhar esses caminhos, né, de ver realmente, né, mais nítido como que os parceiros, os fundos climáticos pudessem, né, estar trabalhando esses recursos, né, e que, na verdade, a gente não viu isso, né. Então, novamente, né, os recursos estão aí, mas não tem um caminho ainda, né, para que possamos levar para os territórios, né. Bom seria se nós conseguirmos, em conjunto, né, destinar esses recursos direto, né, aos territórios indígenas. E nós, no Brasil, nós temos esse mecanismo, né, que facilita, tanto que um dos nossos dois parceiros, né, que estão apoiando essa live, né, que é a Fundação Ford e a Tenure, nós temos contrato direto, né, para que venham fazer assistência dentro do território. Fundação Ford é mais um parceiro, né, de fortalecimento institucional, e a Tenure agora nós estamos na fase que que também acho que é parte do recurso também desse 1,7, né, bilhões, para fortalecimento dos direitos territoriais indígenas, né? Então, se nós temos esse caminho direto com os parceiros, através de nosso fundo, nós conseguimos, né, fazer com que as comunidades possam ter a assistência direta, né? E com esse trabalho, por exemplo, nós, só um exemplo aqui, né, quase 2 milhões de reais vai para uma comunidade, né, para a gente auxiliar no combate ao desmatamento e que eles possam ter seu território protegido e demarcado, no caso aqui no Brasil, né? Então, se nós trabalharmos todas essas questões, possamos, né, dar uma assistência melhor aos povos indígenas. A COP27, para mim, né, ela teve momentos importantes, que foi a participação do Brasil, do presidente Lula, com os povos indígenas, né, dos 7 continentes. Acho que ali, né, ela abre espaço para o Brasil novamente voltar ao cenário nacional, né, a Amazônia, né, o debate, né, do Brasil como um país, né, que já foi ponta de lança nas questões ambientais, né? Eu acho que essa foi um ponto positivo, né, que eu vejo, né, onde o presidente Lula ele se compromete, né, de trabalhar, né, não só as questões ambientais, mas também a questão do direito dos povos indígenas, né? Obrigado.
Thank you very much, Toria. I want to come back to you later with a question on what we can look at now that Lula's back in power, but that'll be for the next third round of questions. But we've heard a lot from, and thank you very much for very practical suggestions on how to improve the direct funding. And because we've been talking a lot about the financing, and of course that is a very, very important aspect of it. So for the second round of questions, that's what I want to focus on. How do we get this financing right? And I want to start with the donors, because we have just heard from them, from their previous answers, that despite the pledge, only a small percentage of that pledge currently has been distributed, and of that, even then, a small percentage, 7%, is has gone directly to Indigenous people. So Jenny, do you mind if I start with you? Could you tell us what's currently being done at a bilateral level to make sure that the amount of money that reaches Indigenous people, will increase in the future?
Thank you. And I guess that is the critical question, particularly for bilaterals. So, I mean, we know there are great challenges for bilateral donors, and particularly, as I'm sure everyone's aware, there are much greater restrictions on the way bilaterals can fund programs, work, and particularly individual organisations. This, as everybody knows, there's a lot more administrative and reporting requirements, and at the moment many of the IP and LC-led organisations do not have the capacity to absorb that funding at scale. So there are many examples of smaller individual projects and programs, but at the scale that we're looking and needing to really increase that 7%, that's where there's the struggle, and it's that we are looking to address. So yes, part of what donors are looking to do, and again there's examples of this, is to increase the capacity of these organisations. And I think it's funding different stages of where we need to get to ensure that direct funding can get there. And so, for example, and I think there's kind of a bit more of a breakdown of the analysis than is in the report, is 53% of the overall donor funding went to strengthen and build capacity of IPs and LCs to protect their rights and manage natural resources, and 51% of that went towards IPLC conservation work. But although international NGOs were the largest funding channel, 51% went to that group of the ways that the money is being dispersed. For public donors, that represented 41% of their funding channels. And for example, for the private donors, a lot more support, 51%, went directly to national NGOs, national social enterprises. So I think it's creating those shifts in, even if the funding has to go via partners and trust intermediaries, it's the level and the types of those intermediaries that donors are also looking to shift. So moving from more global organizations to national organizations, or to even more smaller organizations who are working more directly with those Indigenous and local communities. I mean, there are examples of where direct support is being increased by bilaterals, and if you look at the report, there are examples of that. So for example, Norway very clearly states they are committed to increasing that direct support, and they actually have been working on that for many years. So an example is the seed funding they provided for many Indigenous funds, such as the Fundo Podali and the Fundo Rio Negro. Forgive my pronunciation, in Brazil. So there are examples of how seed funding has been put forward by donors to really increase that at scale. But I would say, finally, there will always be differences, I think, in how private and public funders are working to support IP and LC organizations. So I think as well we should see that as an advantage in many cases, and actually use those opportunities of how actually that can add value. So for example, public donors are often in a position to really work with governments at the level of reforms and the systemic changes which create those, I guess, the foundations and a lot of those enabling environments that will then allow a lot of the work that's happening on the ground to actually be scaled up. So I think that's an example of where there are differences sometimes in the different levels of that funding, but actually what we're looking to do through the pledge is have better coordination between the private and the philanthropic donors for how actually that can be where we can increase those opportunities, where that can create value add and actually be more supportive of each other. So that might be coordination at regional levels or national levels, but I think there are opportunities in the different ways and the different opportunities that different funders are able to work with.
Thanks, Jenny, for that. Casey, can I come to you next and get the perspective, from the private donor, which, like Jenny said, is quite different from the bilateral work?
Yeah, definitely. I think Christensen is a bit different in this group because 78% of our funding is going directly to Indigenous organizations. So we're an organization of 9 people. And I think all too often we talk about capacity on one end, which is usually Indigenous peoples and local communities, when we need to address the capacity of donors. And I think it's time that we as donors really challenge ourselves. I know the bilaterals are a bit different, but I think as private philanthropy, even though Christensen's numbers are pretty good, we still have areas where we can improve on. How can we make things easier? How can we invest more general support in the infrastructure and the kind of plumbing of Indigenous organizations to help them function better and be able to receive funding at scale, as Jenny mentioned? And I think this pledge, despite the challenges, I think, as Jenny highlighted, there's real opportunity for more flexible private funding with more complicated government funding to potentially work together to help get resources to the ground.
Great, thanks, Casey, and really great points around capacity building being I guess going both ways. Toya, can I come to you again? I mean, you gave very detailed answer just now in terms of what can be done to get funding directly to Indigenous communities. What do you think of what Jenny and Casey have just said? And do you have anything else that you want to add there in terms of getting financing right? Toya?
Okay.
There you are.
E as duas coisas eu concordo, né, que é a questão do aumento, né, da porcentagem, né, destinado, né, à questão ambiental. Uma outra é a questão do fortalecimento realmente né, das organizações indígenas e dos fundos, né? Por exemplo, nós temos nós tivemos uma parceria, ou ainda temos, né, com a Fundação Christensen, né, que foi para o fortalecimento do Podali, né? E dessa forma que nós estamos conseguindo agora captar recursos, porque criamos, né, uma equipe capacitada, né, de indígena para conduzir o processo, né, da gestão dos recursos. Então, é necessário realmente, né, que as fundações, né, ou os fundos climáticos e o Estado possam estar investindo também na gestão desse fundo, no melhoramento de quadro de técnicos indígenas para a questão, né, da implementação dos projetos nos territórios, né? Porque quando o Estado, né, ele vai fazer uma implementação de um programa, ele recebe todo o aporte necessário para que o programa venha realmente dar certo na sua implementação, né? Então, é necessário que as organizações e os fundos climáticos possam pensar também nesse sentido, né, que os irmãos do Peru chama as condições habilitantes para que, né, os fundos climáticos possam ser implementados, né, os recursos climáticos possam ser implementados nos territórios indígenas, para que possamos realmente apoiar de fato, né, as ações nos territórios, porque é lá que acontece a situação, é lá que está sendo, né, retirado a madeira, é lá que os povos indígenas estão sendo violentados e sendo assassinados, né? Então, penso que realmente, e que o Keis falou, né, também vê a capacidade dos financiadores de mudar a ideia também, né? De olhar a questão climática e olhar a realidade dos povos indígenas, onde elas se conectam, né? Porque muitas vezes, né, os fundos pensam mais a nível de Estado, né? Não pensa um pouco a realidade dos povos indígenas. Eu acho que também essa questão tem que ser, a gente tem que conversar mais para que possamos, em conjunto, né, utilizar o recurso e fazer uma implementação, né, que dê resultado nos territórios. Obrigado.
Great, thank you very much, Toria. Christina, can I come to you next? And I want to ask you actually about the Green Climate Fund, because, you know, they have a big pot of money and they also have an Indigenous Peoples policy. How are they actually doing? And, you know, what's their reach to communities like yours?
Thank you. I think this is a very important conversation. And having heard both an example of the private donors, we have also been beneficiaries of the Christensen Fund in the past with very good experience. But we've also seen how the bilateral and the public donors have also tried to reach Indigenous communities. Now, the situation is that, for instance, with the Green Climate Fund, it is important for governments and for donor agencies to ensure that governments are held accountable to report where these funds are going, and that these funds really create no harm and does no more damage to Indigenous territories in particular. One of the things that we find in my experience in Belize is that sometimes these projects, these climate projects, climate actions that are funded by funders like through the Green Climate Fund have in fact disenfranchised even further Indigenous communities. For instance, we find that while these funding have an Indigenous Peoples policy, the implementers of these projects do not know and are not aware and are not apprised of the Indigenous Peoples policy and guidelines. And so it's very important to include Indigenous people from the design of these projects, to incorporate their inputs and to ensure that not just Indigenous peoples understand their rights and understand these policies that protect their rights, but also the governments that you're working with, the intermediaries that are implementing these projects. And so while it's important that funding goes directly to Indigenous peoples organizations and Indigenous communities, it's also important that if funding goes through intermediaries, which is what we're trying to balance, that they are aware of these policies so that they're very clear. Whatever climate action, whatever efforts are being made, that it in fact follows the respect and the rights of Indigenous peoples. I also wanted to comment just very quickly on the issue of the capacities of Indigenous peoples. It is it is very important for donors to understand that the capacity of Indigenous peoples also require the strengthening of Indigenous governance institutions who are the direct representatives of communities. And so I think that it's important for us to have long-term partnerships with donors because, you know, land tenure rights, climate change efforts are not short-term projects, right? We have to see them as long-term partnerships. We're in this together. And I think that it's important to underscore that the investment in Indigenous people's capacities to administer, to scale this kind of funding is critical if we're going to see successful results. For instance, right now, we've been partnering with the International Land Tenure Facility, and I think that over the last year, they themselves have been evaluating how it is that they partner with Indigenous communities and provide funding directly to communities. They've worked very diligently to try to make it a simpler process, to try to help to build the mechanisms necessary for Indigenous organizations to manage the size of funding, and for us to really scale up our dialogue with our government so that there is a coordinated national effort to really look at what is it that we're doing to combat climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina, for those very, very salient points. Juan Carlos, coming to you last for this round of questions. What are your thoughts when it comes to, you know, challenges for Indigenous people and local communities when it comes to direct financing?
Muchas gracias. Yo creo que este es un tema sumamente importante porque nosotros siempre vamos a tratar de elevar nuestra demanda emergente del territorio. En el territorio, las organizaciones indígenas por muchos años primero hablan de seguridad de su casa, del territorio, de su pueblo y las amenazas reales. No es solo el dinero, es la vida mismo que se tiene que asegurar, la seguridad de su casa y de dónde va a alimentarse y dónde va a vivir. Más que todo, es importante entender esas demandas va conectado con un reclamo del derecho al ser humano, al derecho al respeto. Esos derechos que muchos gobiernos dicen que lo ponemos en derechos colectivos y tienen que respetar en lo local, nacional e internacional. El financiamiento, el tema de financiamiento es importante, sí, porque luego de asegurar tu casa tienes la gobernanza. En esa gobernanza tiene que articularse, si llega a 1%, se aplaude la colaboración que hace del 1.7 billones. Se reconoce que históricamente los gobiernos y la filantropía están donando. Más que todo, luego de ese contexto, se aplaude ver cómo se va a distribuir. Tiene que existir transparencia en el proceso. Tienen que estar los actores reales en el proceso, la consulta, la participación plena y efectiva, desde el principio hasta el final. Está bien, 1% no estaba correcto, pero luego se sube al 7%, vemos que está avanzando. Hay muchas entidades, como mencionan mis hermanos y mis hermanas, que están colaborando, fortaleciendo entidades filantrópicas, Fundación Ford, Christian San Juan y otras más, que hacen el esfuerzo para apoyar esta colaboración. Muchos fondos desaparecen desde arriba y llega una gotita, un poquitito abajo. No está bien. Para que sea efectivo, se debe reconocer las capacidades. Existen ejemplos muy fuertes en territorio. No tenemos que volver a inventarnos el agua tibia o descubrir el juego. Existen trabajos, existen propuestas. Nosotros, los pueblos indígenas territoriales,
en el marco de la alianza global, con territorio, con recursos, con estructura, con historia, en temas de finanzas, en temas de política, en temas de derechos, llevando esa demanda emergente, decimos y propusimos qué significa el modelo financiamiento de Shandel. Primero, significa que tenemos que tener transparencia, respeto a las estructuras, hacia los derechos de los pueblos. Es un marco político global donde miramos y entendemos que hay otros sistemas financieros que muchos están trabajando ya en territorio y otros que tenemos que evaluar, otros que tenemos que cambiar. Entonces, es importante en esta emergencia no solo mirar el tema monetario, el tema económico, va una cuestión más de fondo, el proceso del derecho al ser humano, derecho a los pueblos indígenas, derecho a las comunidades rurales, territorial, la seguridad de la casa y la gobernanza. Esos instrumentos en los modelos financieros recoge todo el marco político de Shandia. Elevamos al mundo. Todavía no están entendiendo qué significa el modelo Shandia. Significa que tenemos que tener una cordialidad, articulación, transparencia en los modelos financieros y seguir apoyando a los sistemas propios de las estructuras, de las organizaciones, de las asociaciones, de las mujeres, de los jóvenes, de los territorios, de los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales. Se aplaude la colaboración y se reconoce siempre el apoyo de las organizaciones donantes.
Great. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. Jenny, Casey, very, very briefly, I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask if either of you, want to come in very briefly to, address any specific concerns or points raised by the Indigenous leaders before we go on to the final round of questions. Anything? No? Okay. Oh, Jenny, did you want to come in very briefly?
Well, I was just going to say, I found that really interesting. And I think actually that shows to me that we're a lot more on the same page in terms of how we need to and should continue to work together. And it's really recognized from what I'm hearing that we're all saying that capacity side, the different ways that things need to be scaled up. Actually, that partnership and that dialogue, it seems that there is a lot of shared agreement on that. So it's really encouraging from what's been said to hear that.
Yeah, and I'll just say finally that transparency needs to be increased on all sides, donors, grassroots, including intermediaries. And I think intermediaries, both Indigenous-led and non-Indigenous-led, need to have accountability as well, as the increased financing is not reaching the ground. It's going to other organizations, and those organizations are intermediaries. And what if we could work towards a world where communities could actually choose the intermediaries that they want to work with rather than the other way around?
Great, thank you so much. Now, last round of questions before we open the floor for Q&A. And for this particular round, I actually want us to look into the future, right? We've talked about lessons learned from COP27. How can we use them to get things right at COP28 next year, or even COP15, which is the biodiversity negotiations that are starting in a few days, right? That's under a different convention and framework, so they're not the same, but maybe there's still quite a lot of things that can be done. Toya, can I ask you to start for this, discussions, and perhaps, talk about some of the changes that we can expect now that, we have Lula, somebody like Lula, an environmentally conscious leader who has promised to protect the Amazon. So what does the future hold?
Bom, depois de 4 anos nebuloso no Brasil, né, a gente vê, né, vamos dizer assim, uma luz no final do túnel, né? E com o presidente Lula comandando o Estado brasileiro, Nós temos agora, nesse momento, né, um grupo de trabalho, né, para que possamos apresentar ao governo Lula os 100 dias, né, de ações que o governo deve fazer nas questões indígenas. Uma das questões, né, que a gente vê, né, aqui enquanto Brasil é o fortalecimento das instituições enquanto FUNAI, né, que cuida dos direitos dos povos indígenas, a CESAI, que é uma Secretaria Especial de Saúde, a educação, né? Mas a nível global, que também a gente olha muito para a Amazônia brasileira, ou para a Amazônia, para as florestas tropicais, é o compromisso do Estado brasileiro, através do governo Lula, de demarcar os territórios indígenas. Eu penso que, para o futuro, né, o que nós queremos enquanto indígena, eu acho que não só da Amazônia brasileira, mas de todos os 7 continentes, é ver nossos territórios garantidos para que nossa população possa viver em paz e com dignidade nos nossos territórios. Mas também, né, guardar toda essa riqueza dos biomas, né, não só para os povos indígenas, mas para toda a humanidade, né? Então, eu vejo um futuro, né, que, através do Brasil, possamos, né, levar essa mensagem, né, e que também, né, aí caberia os fundos climáticos também aportar parte do recurso para demarcação e titularização dos territórios indígenas, né? Porque aí também nós estaríamos garantindo não só a terra na mão dos povos indígenas, mas também a preservação dos biomas, né? E, claro, utilizando da melhor forma possível. Isso que eu vejo no futuro. Obrigado.
Thanks, Turia. And yeah, great point you make about now you see light at the end of the tunnel. Casey, can I come back to you again? Because, you know, when we were planning, discussing this particular webinar, you were talking about how, you know, COP27 had a very, very narrow focus on carbon and that how this could leave Indigenous peoples behind. Can you explain a little bit more about why you're concerned and what can be done to address this in, you know, in COP15 as well as in COP28?
Yeah, definitely. And I think our Indigenous leaders could probably speak to this better, so I'll be brief. But I think carbon was a big theme at COP27. I think world leaders are seeing carbon as one of the go-to solutions to addressing climate change. And what does that effectively do? It allows most governments and countries to pretty much operate as normal while placing the burden on Indigenous peoples' territories. And I think the questions around carbon, the benefits towards communities, and whether these processes will respect Indigenous peoples and local community rights are definitely in question. And I think Indigenous peoples were very loud and clear that they do not want to bear the burden of the world's climate change solutions without change on their side as well.
That's a really good point. Christina, can I come to you next? You know, like I said earlier, COP15 is just around the corner. What recommendations do you have for those who are attending to make sure that Indigenous voices are heard? And also, you know, feel free to add to or respond to what Casey just said about carbon and this burden being placed unfairly on Indigenous people to solve all the problems that the developed world has now, you know, created and then being put on them.
Thank you. I think that a few points I'd like to raise where the overarching concerns of Indigenous people is really to ensure that whatever is done, that it protects the Indigenous collective land tenure systems that exist globally, first and foremost, and that it upholds, you know, the international standards that exist to protect these rights, for instance, free, prior, informed consent processes, and that strengthen the decision-making capacities of the communities. For instance, right now, we have before us COP15, where we're talking about biodiversity, but you cannot talk about biodiversity in the absence of Indigenous peoples and their relationship to their forests, their relationship to their lands. It's important also to make the distinction between Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, and local communities. It is very clear that a lot of times we get sort of pulled together, and so the real concerns and interests of Indigenous communities are often diminished in these dialogues. I say that not to say that the concerns and issues of local communities are less, but only to say that Indigenous peoples have, they are rights holders. They have a set of recognized international rights as Indigenous peoples to their lands and territories. They often live on autonomous territories, and more importantly, they have important value systems and cosmovision that really speak to the stewardship of their natural resources and forests. So I think that it's important then to recognize and underscore and not forget that the traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples is pertinent in the dialogues and the discussions around climate change. I mean, we cannot overemphasize that Indigenous peoples themselves are already taking affirmative action to adapt to some of these climate changes, and already putting in place measures to mitigate. But we can't be doing this ourselves. I mean, we really have to hold the polluters responsible. We really have to hold governments responsible. And I think that we are doing our part. We've been sounding the alarm for a long, long time. And it's important that now we recognize that, look, we're all in this together. And I think that it's important to really see the importance of the voice of Indigenous people in the design, in the decision making. We can't continue to operate on the margins. Otherwise, we will all fail. We will fail our future generations. We will fail our children. And we will not be able to deliver a home and a planet to our future in a respectful way, the way that we have enjoyed our life on this planet.
Thank you, Christina. Powerful words. I want to move on to Jenny. Jenny, can you tell us more about this Forest Tenure Funders Group and what they have in store for the next COP and beyond?
Thank you. Yes, so the Forest Tenure Funders Group is essentially a donor working group which was established in January this year to really take forward and ensure that together we're delivering on the pledge commitments. So this reflects that it was never supposed to be just an announcement, but it was about how the donors can work together and with other and wider stakeholders, such as the Indigenous and community organisations themselves, wider stakeholders such as implementation organisations, to actually achieve those pledge ambitions, such as looking to how we can develop and scale up those funding mechanisms that are more effective, or as Casey and I think framed it very well, how we can ensure that certain types of intermediaries who are trusted partners, for example, are being invested in a greater scale. So the donor working group over this first year, as it's been established, has started to conduct some more research into effective what is working, what isn't working in terms of those funding mechanisms. Another area we've been working on is how we can develop a set of donor principles which can really underlie the way donors should be and would like to be, or aspiring to be, over the course of the pledge, funding and supporting work on secure forest tenure more effectively. I would also emphasise, and perhaps we haven't said this enough during this call today, is that the focus of the pledge is on secure forest tenure, very specifically. Obviously, that can encompass many things, but in terms of looking forward over the next year, I think, and in terms of the questions on CBD and COP over the next couple of weeks, I think we see that secure forest tenure as a really critical foundation to achieve many of those conservation goals and ambitions. So I think it's also how we can, over the next few years, really try and increase that security of tenure for those forest communities communities, which will then allow more of those conservation and biodiversity goals to be achieved. I think something else I'd say, and certainly from our perspective as a bilateral, is the pledge has influenced in many ways some of those policy developments, because of the pledge and that visibility and momentum, it's made more awareness of how that needs to be included, how IP and LC rights needs to be better included in such documents, how land rights need to be included. So I hope over the next few years we'll see that increasing as we have better awareness of how important that is. Back to the funders group perspective, we're having a meeting next week to really develop and decide our goals for the year ahead. But I certainly think that working with others on those funding mechanisms and how they can be more effective, and as Casey said, how we can identify intermediaries that are working more effectively with organisations led by Indigenous communities will be a critical focus.
Thanks, Jenny. Last question before we open to the floor to Q&A. Juan Carlos, can I come to you? Tell us about your hopes and what you want to achieve for COP28. You know, what should be the goal?
Creo que es importante entender dos cosas en este marco de esta pregunta. Primero, ¿cuál es la relación? ¿Por qué existió este reconocimiento del 1.7? Cualquier número que sea el monto, hay un reconocimiento del sistema internacional del 1.7 billones de dólares para pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales. ¿Cuál es el espíritu de esto? Y hay un reconocimiento. La ciencia reconoce, las investigaciones nos mencionan los pueblos indígenas. ¿Y cuál es la propuesta que hace la Alianza Global de Comunidades Territoriales? ¿Cuál es la propuesta? ¿Cuál es el espíritu de Shandia? Shandia recoge la visión de los pueblos indígenas. En los territorios, la biodiversidad no puede estar separado, es uno solo, es pueblos indígenas y el bosque y los territorios están súper conectados culturalmente, con visión, con historia, con idioma. Es difícil transmitir, pero Shandia recoge eso. No es solo el tema financiero, pero reclama la distribución de esos financiamientos, de esas promesas, a dónde tienen que aterrizar. El otro contexto es la dinámica de la colaboración colectiva, que se tiene que reconocer. Los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales vivimos en zonas sumamente protegidos que estamos cuidando por milenariamente esos recursos. Bosques vírgenes. Damos vida, damos oxígeno, contribuimos al planeta, pero tenemos graves amenazas, graves demandas diariamente, persecuciones, derechos contra los pueblos indígenas, etcétera, etcétera. Puedo seguir, pero hay luchas, hay propuestas, hay ejercicios, y eso es lo que reclamamos con Shandia, para presentar en ese ecosistema de financiamiento que existe. Llamamos a la concientización. No es solamente doy el dinero, me lavo las manos y me voy a destruir otro lado. No. Nosotros somos colectivos. Trabajamos colectivamente con pueblos indígenas a nivel global, con los trópicos, con las montañas, con los desiertos, con los árticos. Nos conecta el espíritu, el lenguaje espiritual de los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales. Y hemos mantenido estos ecosistemas únicos ahora. Y el reto es seguir articulando en las plataformas y en la biodiversidad, en la COP15. Tenemos que seguir trabajando, comunicando en unidad, articulando en unidad, porque el trabajo sigue, la demanda sigue. No es ahora, pero hay la esperanza, ¿no? Hay la esperanza. Hay gente muy buena que quiere apoyar, reconoce, gracias al trabajo de los líderes y lideresas, gracias a las organizaciones, nuestros reclamos, pero el costo es alto. El costo es alto. Hay mucha problemática minuto a minuto en los territorios. Se están perdiendo la vida de los ríos, la contaminación, la deforestación, etcétera. Y sobre todo, tenemos que
Juan Carlos, we've lost you. I think you were on mute again.
Cuida,
Okay, I think you're back.
cuida la vida de los pueblos indígenas, respeta la vida de los pueblos indígenas, estás respetando la vida de la madre tierra y de los ecosistemas. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Now we're going to move on to the next part of them, which is the Q&A. We already have quite a lot of questions coming in, and we have about 20 minutes. So I'm going to try and, put like 3 questions at a time, and then just throw it to the speakers and ask them to respond. Or some questions are directed specifically to people, and I'll ask them to respond. Otherwise, I'll ask the speakers, whoever wants to respond can do it. For the first round, I want to take 3 questions. Juan Carlos has already briefly spoken just now about the Shandia mechanism, but Toya, there is a specific question asking you to explain more about it, more about the Shandia mechanism. So that's the first question. So the second question is that the attendee is asking that, one of the differences between COP26 and 27 is that governments are now facing austere budgets and there's a global economic downturn. Would that lead to any donor backtracking? It's not directed to any speaker, so I'll leave it to speakers to decide if they want to respond to this. And then a third question is specifically to Casey and Jenny. Is how do you think donors can or may support advocacy in countries where there are repressive conditions to receive funding for human rights work? And that the speakers mentioned earlier that in most cases, the national level organizations are the conduit for funds. But what happens when, when the government is repressive? Toya, can I first come to you to explain a bit more about the Shandia mechanism, and then maybe to Casey and Jenny about the donor, and then I'll ask whoever wants to talk about the concern around donor backtracking. Maybe Casey and Jenny, you could also perhaps touch on briefly on that. But Toya, can I first come to you so you can explain a bit more about the Shandia mechanism? Thank you.
Bom, o mecanismo Xande, eu acho que é melhor o Juanca explicar, né? Eu posso trabalhar um pouco sobre o Podali, né? Que talvez seja mais ou menos parecido com o Xandia, né? Então, o nosso fundo, né? Ele é um fundo, né? Construído pelos povos indígenas e destinado a auxiliar, né, aos 170 povos indígenas na Amazônia brasileira. Né? Então, ele tem uma diretoria exclusivamente indígena e nessa primeira diretoria totalmente conduzido pelas mulheres, né? E então essa é um pouco da diferenciação também, né? Ele faz a captação de recursos, né, e distribui, né, através de editais, né, nos territórios indígenas, né? Então esse é um dos princípios, né, que o nosso fundo ele trabalha, captar recursos, né, já que o poder das associações indígenas na questão da gestão é menos, né? Então ela vai distribuir recursos também no valor de 50 mil, de 100 mil, até 200 mil reais, né? Em torno de 40 mil dólares. né? Dessa forma, né, os recursos eles chegam diretamente nos territórios indígenas, né? Então, a própria e o fundo ele faz o acompanhamento, né, dos projetos, orientando, né, a comunidade como fazer o relatório, como fazer a prestação de conta, né? Para que, né, as comunidades também, através de suas associações, possam se fortalecer, né, que é a área de formação, né, que é importante, porque o que nós queremos é também que possamos ter os mecanismos de captação de recursos, mas também qualificando o nosso quadro de pessoal para que esse recurso seja utilizado da melhor forma possível, né? Então, o fundo ele é um distribuidor, vamos dizer assim, de recursos em cima dos temas que foi deliberado pela Assembleia a ser trabalhado na Amazônia. Okay? Obrigado.
Thank you. Juan Carlos, do you want to come in briefly? Because Toya just said that you'd be the better person to actually explain the Shandia mechanism. You spoke about it just now in your answer, but is there anything else you might want to add?
No, simplemente yo quiero recapitular, precisar. Hace muchos años, desde que el movimiento indígena se empieza a organizar, hubo mucho apoyo para organización de la gobernanza, territorios, pero hubo una prohibición, una mitificación de que no debemos entender bien el sistema financiero. Eso yo llamo el espíritu de Shandia, es transparentar en ese ecosistema, ser transparentes cómo funcionan los mecanismos financieros a nivel global que van a nuestros territorios. No es un invento de nosotros. La ciencia, las investigaciones están diciendo que no están llegando todos esos dineros a los territorios. El mecanismo Shandia es el marco político, es el espacio para que se canalice de una forma directa esos recursos que mis hermanos, mis hermanas, jóvenes, mujeres, están trabajando en los territorios, día a día en los territorios. Entonces, el mecanismo Shandia reclamó al mundo y es la plataforma y es el ecosistema donde habla, converge, coordina con otros mecanismos para llegar a los beneficiarios directamente. Los intermediarios es otra cosa. Hay mucho que hablar. Los gobiernos es otra cosa. Pero en el sistema internacional, en el marco de los derechos, decimos, no somos solo beneficiarios, somos socios, porque tenemos derechos y somos actores en este proceso. Con nosotros no podemos dejarnos atrás. La solución para esta crisis, para este momento, es con nosotros, con los pueblos y con todos. Tenemos que trabajar. Mecanismo Shandia trabaja en la línea financiera, estudia la línea financiera y los protocolos, principios, eso recoge para coordinar, más no para pelear, enfrentar, sino ese es un cambio de mentalidad, es un cambio de filantropía, es un cambio de paradigma al sistema financiero global. Ese es el espíritu de Shandia que recoge los sentimientos, los pensamientos de los pueblos y nacionalidades, cómo quieren trabajar en sus territorios. Gracias.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Casey, Jenny, there are questions for you. Casey, can I come to you first? How can donors support advocacy in countries when the government is repressive. And Jenny, maybe you can respond to that and also talk about this question, whether there are concerns about donor backtracking, because the question is about governments facing, you know, more austerity budgets. Casey.
Yeah, that's complicated. I would say that politics change. So invest in organizations' infrastructure now so that they can be strong organizations in the case that they are under oppression in the future. Additionally, investing in intermediaries at times like this and Indigenous-led funds does allow for flexibility when supporting these situations.
Thank you, Casey. Jenny.
And to add to that, I'd say that actually a lot of the fund, or majority of the funding, is going to international NGOs. So it's not governments themselves, it's non-governmental organisations. That's already what's happening. I'd also say that, particularly in the case of bilateral donors, a lot of it is, again, not given to the governments directly. Where we are working with governments, it's capacity building for them. So it's funding through intermediaries who are working with governments, and that would be on how to improve the rights, including human rights of communities. So I think there's work that, even though you're working with governments, sometimes it's on how you can ensure that certain requirements or reforms are in place. I'd say that also, from a bilateral perspective, there's, you know, it's an ongoing part of the way that bilaterals work in country, is how to ensure that that issue it is being addressed. So I think there's many different levels to ensure that we are working to change those structures, but also to ensure the funding is not going directly to those regimes where there are those issues.
Great, thank you. Are there, do you also want to touch on briefly whether, you know, from just based on your experience and what you're hearing from, whether there are concerns of donors not being able to, you know, provide the pledges or, you know, commit to their pledges because of the economic downturn?
Yes, sorry, yes, good question. And I'm sure I can understand why that question is being asked. I think in some ways that, and I can't speak on behalf of all the donors, bilateral donors, but certainly from what we understand, in a way that was part of the purpose of the pledge in itself, and having that announcement and such a visible public announcement at COP26. So whether or not things might change, the point is that we have that accountability, and if anything changes, we have that accountability to explain why. I mean, I think that having that very public announcement does put that pressure internally on organisations to have to find every way to meet that. There are many of those bilaterals, including the UK, who have released their figure, their contribution to the pledge. So increasing the transparency in that way will increase how donors are held accountable.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm going to take another round of questions, 3 more, and it would be great if the speakers can, you know, keep the answers to about 2 minutes each. Now, the first question is for either Toya or Juan Carlos. They're asking, and I think Christina, you could probably answer this as well if you want to. Have there been incidents of reprisals against those communities who have received direct funding, and whether this contribute to or create any community dynamics? That's the first question. And then another question is, perhaps maybe this is something either donors or the Indigenous leaders can respond to. How can NGOs who have been asked by Indigenous peoples to support their community forestry, land concessions, access the funding from the COP? And the third question is that Indigenous peoples are asking for a transparent database of individual donor grants so that they can track the money. And this person asked that while the UK, the US, and Germany have complex reporting requirements for Indigenous peoples, I have learned from my reporting that these 3 bilaterals actually refuse to publish information about their own individual grants, and they only publish collective amounts in their progress reports. And the question is twofold. First, to Jenny, in the case of UK, what's the justification for not publishing individual grants? And then the second question to Juan Carlos or Christina is, they would like to hear your thoughts on this lack of transparency from donors. But first, maybe Toya, Juan Carlos, or Christina, can I hear from one of you about whether there's been incidents of reprisals against communities who have received direct funding? Toya, did you want to go first?
Primeiro de tudo, a gente gostaria de parabenizar aqui as organizações que receberam recurso direto, né? E aos parceiros que também acreditaram, né, nessas organizações e financiaram diretamente, né? Eu não tenho nenhum conhecimento sobre se alguma comunidade ou alguma organização indígena sofreu esse tipo de ação, né? Muito pelo contrário, né? Inclusive, né, os aportes que foram dados, nós temos o maior cuidado, né, com os parceiros da gente, como diz no Brasil, jogar limpo, né? Tanto que com o trabalho que nós estamos fazendo com Ford, com Christie's e com a Tenor, né, é a construção de parceria no diálogo, né? Construindo nosso projeto em conjunto, né? Então, dessa forma, nós criamos uma dinâmica de parceria mais próximo e de responsabilidade entre a gente, né? E, claro, não escondendo nada, tanto nossas fraquezas enquanto instituição, mas como nossos pontos positivos, né? E em conjunto vamos tentando sanar esses pontos negativos para que o nosso projeto possa ser bem implementado e que nossas comunidades possam ter, né, o melhor possível dos resultados desse projeto, né? E bom seria se muito mais organizações pudessem fazer esse aporte, né, com essa confiança, com essa transparência, né? Porque também o parceiro tem que ser transparente e dizer, não, o meu recurso, ele não vai apoiar esse tipo de ação, né? Para que a gente possa construir projetos, né, que realmente foquem na comunidade, né? Não foque somente no que o parceiro pensa em realizar em termos de política internacional sobre clima, né? Mas pensar também no dia a dia, no projeto da comunidade, né? Então, não temos nenhum caso desse tipo. O que nós temos agora no Brasil é a questão dos créditos de carbono, né? Então, está havendo muita incidência nas comunidades, estamos tentando, né, levar, né, informações para que a comunidade possa ter mais informações e, se ela quiser fazer o contrato, ela faça, senão, né, ela deixa para lá, né? Ok, obrigado.
Thank you, Toya. Christina, can I come to you? Do you have any comments on this response? You know, direct funding with your experience in Southern Belize, but also a comment on this transparency question as well.
Well, certainly, as we have said before, you know, the direct funding to Indigenous peoples is very limited. I have not really seen direct reprisals, but I do see where there are systematic ways in which Indigenous peoples are punished in some ways. For instance, when Indigenous organizations, and in my own personal experience, whenever you try to apply for funding from bilateral agencies working with the government, often there is a requirement for you to have the endorsement of the government. Bear in mind that this is the same governments that you have been in battle with over land tenure rights. Perhaps in instances like in the Maya case, we have taken our governments to court for failure to recognize our land tenure rights and protect it. And so we're not necessarily, one of the conditions that is asked then is, are you in good standing with the government? And the government determines what that means. And so you have no access to these fundings. In addition to that, we find a lot of times that a lot of the funding that's targeted towards Indigenous communities, governments often want to avoid these problematic communities. And so they take this funding and make it a national funding. And so often then that is one way in which we are restricted. I would like to change the question just a little bit and emphasize the importance of direct funding to Indigenous communities. What it does is that it gives you leverage. It gives Indigenous peoples positions leverage. What I mean by that is that it helps to shift the power imbalance that exists. Governments with a lot of funding can do a lot of damage to Indigenous peoples' territories. Indigenous peoples with direct funding can leverage that power imbalance and can be able then to continue to advance the protection of their lands and territories. For instance, the support that we have right now with the land tenure facility has really made significant contributions towards our advancement of the implementation of our land tenure rights. Another big issue here is that a lot of this funding comes to large conservation organizations. And what we see often happening is a tremendous amount of land grabs from Indigenous territories that, in the name of conservation or in the name of carbon credits, have taken away a number of communities' Indigenous lands, and they have really threatened the security of tenure for our communities. And so I would like to see a time, because Indigenous peoples, we must recognize that we have our own dreams and visions for our lands, right? We have our own dreams and visions for our well-being, advancing our well-being. And we must be careful not to risk restricting these advancements. We are prepared to engage with donor communities in joint ventures. We can't always be on the receiving end, just accepting development that is imposed upon our communities. We are prepared to propose joint venture initiatives, initiatives that leverage our cultural heritage with our natural resources. And so I think that it's important when we think about Indigenous peoples and funding, that we think about what is it that Indigenous peoples are proposing, what is their dream for their future, and how is it that we can support those efforts. I would like to see a time when governments are asked to produce a letter of endorsement from Indigenous communities, or intermediary organizations are asked to produce a letter of endorsement from Indigenous communities to access these funds.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. We are really running out of time, but I do want to make sure that we've actually answered the second round of questions. And I also want to ask the speakers to, give one last final thoughts before we end. So Juan Carlos, do you have anything you want to add in terms of this lack of transparency question? If you could keep the answer very, very brief, that would be great. And then after that, I'm going to ask Jenny to respond, and then end with Casey responding to the question on accessing the COP funding. Juan Carlos, do you have anything very briefly that you might want to add?
Bueno, muchas gracias. Yo creo que es importante conectar lo que manifiestan mis líderes y lideresas de los territorios. Y es importante sintetizar y transmitir al sistema internacional. Es importantísimo también no perder ese caminar que han hecho nuestros lideresas y nuestros mayores que están en el destino, en la tierra, en el más allá. Reconocer ese proceso, porque bajo esa dinámica llegamos a este punto, a un punto de que reclamamos justicia climática, derechos, el tema de reconocimiento, visibilización, pero manifestando el tema de la transparencia sobre los financiamientos. Se tiene que cambiar el sistema, el paradigma, se tiene que reconectar y reevaluar. Eso es lo que reclama Shandia al sistema internacional financiero. Entonces, hay una conectividad, hay una visibilización. Los pueblos indígenas están con propuestas, están trabajando y están en territorio. Es el día a día, en primera línea. Y para finalizar, creo que es importantísimo recordar las menciones que hacen nuestros hermanos y hermanas en las comunidades locales. ¿Dónde está la mayor diversidad, esa biblioteca que milenariamente ha transcurrido en el tiempo? ¿Dónde están esos saberes? Están en nuestros territorios, en nuestros bosques. Ya no hay tiempo. Tenemos amenaza y estamos en puntos muy, muy irreversibles. Es el momento de actuar ya.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Jenny, do you want to respond to that question around the transparency? Just very briefly.
Yes, sorry, I'll have to just do a very brief initial answer. The UK does have, part of the UK, we do have a very strict policy of transparency of how the way we're working, who we're working with. There's a platform called Dev Tracker. I can share this in the chat, which gives detailed information about who we're working with. There's annual reporting on how that's been implemented, progress towards the program targets. I can't speak on behalf of all the donors, but I know that many others have this in place because there are transparency requirements. So there may be more information out there. And then really just back to the pledge and that commitment to, transparency and greater accountability. And as I mentioned earlier, I think already, even just over the course of this last year, we've seen increasing figures being released publicly by organisations. Casey's one example. And as I say, there's been further information coming from the bilateral donors as well. So I do think that pattern is increasing, as well as the kind of breakdown for IP and LC organisations and how we meet those particular our commitments towards the pledge. I do think that information is flowing and will continue to do so. And as I say, through the pledge, we look to I guess increase that through ourselves and through the donors. I think that there will be greater accountability and almost pressure on us to do that.
Thank you, Jenny. Casey, do you want to take the last one on how to access funding?
Sure. I think it's important to look at the reporting that's coming out of the COPs. So I will post in the chat now a link to the report from the Forest Tenure Funders Group that links all of the organizations that they're giving money to. As Jenny highlighted, most of them are intermediaries. So I encourage you to reach out to those intermediaries, see how they're using their funding from COP pledges and see if you might be able to access that funding. And additionally, finally, I would say reach out to donors directly. They're putting their pledges out there, they're being public. I think it's time that we have better communication and transparency between donors and grantees, and not view them as grantees, but view them as colleagues, because we're all needed in this kind of collective effort to address the world's most pressing needs.
Thank you so much, Casey. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We're 6 minutes over from when we were supposed to due to finish. So we're going to have to end the event right now. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Can we give them a virtual round of applause, please, for all of their insights and for their candid, thoughts and reflections. We've had a very wide-ranging discussion around what went right, what went wrong, what we could do better, and also a lot of actually, despite some sobering thoughts, a lot of opportunities and things that are being worked on as well. So, thank you so much to you as well, the audience, for your participation and for staying long after, 6 minutes after when we should have finished the event. Thank you also to our hosts, the Fort Foundation, the Land Portal Foundation, the Tenure Facility, and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. It's been a real pleasure for me to moderate this event. Have a great day, afternoon, evening, or night. Goodbye, and thank you.
Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.
Obrigado.